So let me introduce Dan Bursch first. Dan graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1979 with a Bachelor of Science degree. He received a Master of Engineering Science degree from the Naval Postgraduate School in 1991. He was a Naval Flight Officer, volunteer navigator with the A-6 Intruder, and went through the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School as a test flight officer. In July 1991, Dan became an astronaut with NASA. He's a veteran of 4 space flights, and he's logged over 227 days in space. 227 days in space. He was a mission specialist on 3 flights, 3 shuttle flights, I should say, STS-51, STS-68, and STS-77 back in the mid-90s. And then he served as a flight engineer on ISS, International Space Station Expedition 4, in 2001 and 2002. At that time, when he was on Expedition 4, he logged 196 days on the space station in flight. That's more than half a year being orbiting the Earth. Dan left NASA in May of 2005 and retired from the Navy's captain later that year. He's now serving as the National Reconnaissance Chair at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, meaning he's still involved with space and satellite. Dan will speak about the Apollo program and the astronauts such as Neil Armstrong and what they meant to the U.S. space exploration efforts in general and to him personally as a young man growing up. Dan Bursch.
Thanks, Bob, very much. I have some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that I don't have any slides for you today, but the good news is I'm going to be speaking for less than 8 minutes. And that's shorter than the time that it takes us to get to orbit, so hopefully we can all hang on for that long. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to today's tribute to our veterans and to Neil Armstrong. And thank you for allowing me to participate in this great day. According to the press release, I'm supposed to talk about what the Apollo moon landings meant to the U.S. and the world. But you know, sometimes astronauts are like politicians. Well, we end up talking about what we want to talk about. So I know that politics are pretty much fresh in everybody's mind right now, and we are ready to keep moving on, hopefully. But I really do think that everyone here knows what the Apollo missions meant to the U.S. and the world. It was signified the end of the space race, or at least the space race back then. And more importantly, I think it basically said that we made a commitment. President Kennedy made the commitment. Said that we would do something, and gosh darn it, we did it. And it's, to me, that's what the Apollo missions symbolize. Now, what I would like to share with all of you today is what the missions meant to me as a young kid born in 1957, the year of Sputnik, and some consider the year that the space race began. For the young folks here today, I hope you can relate to what it may have been like living back then and growing up back then. The older folks like me, I hope this sparks some fond memories in your past. Growing up as a soon-to-be teenager in the late 1960s, I remember 2 types of major events that our family would gather around the TV. Space missions and the Olympics. That's what it was in our family. If it was space or if it was Olympics, we'd be around the TV. And before we had VCRs or DVRs or TiVos, my dad had a Super 8mm camera, remember those? And he would record events looking at the black and white TV and recording it with his film camera. And for the young kids, that means recording something on film and weeks later getting the film back and playing, no kidding, home movies on a real projector. When Neil and Buzz landed on the moon, I was at summer camp in 1969, in July 1969. We were about to go in for dinner. It was kind of a tough summer camp. We actually had to kind of be in formation before we went in for dinner. And I remember listening on the radio as the Eagle landed at Tranquility Base. And if you recall, it was several hours after that time that he actually spoke his most famous words. And I never heard him actually speak those famous words real time when he said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." We were already asleep. Like I said, it was a strict camp. But I know that millions of Americans and people all around the world were stayed up late that night, kids in sleeping bags, and the whole world gathering around radios and televisions, anxious to be part of that glorious moment. I still remember afterwards the commemorative posters, coins, magazines, and models that came out later in the local five and dime and department stores. Yes, that was the way it was before the internet could capture our attention. 2 years prior, I had written one of my first book reports in school on the Apollo program. I was a budding space cadet. Listening to the radio on that day was a moment where I was hooked. I caught the astronaut bug, but I didn't actively pursue it until after I graduated from the Naval Academy, done a tour in the Navy in A6 intruders, and then I graduated from the Navy Test Pilot School as a test flight officer. After several bolters, i.e. missed attempts at applying for the astronaut program, I finally got my chance in 1990. So there I was in 1990, a new guy. That summer we did have an astronaut reunion. Every couple of years the astronauts have a reunion down in Houston. And I met many of the famous Apollo guys like Buzz Aldrin and Bill Anders. John Young was still active in the office. And it was funny, at these reunions, us shuttle people would kind of gather around and talk amongst each other and say, boy, wouldn't it have been nice to be one of those Apollo people. You know, the Apollo guys they were icons. I mean, they were gods to us when we were there. And I later found out the Apollo guys were around at the same reunion talking amongst themselves saying, boy, wouldn't it be cool to be one of those shuttle guys and launch like a rocket and land like an airplane and go to the International Space Station and have all that room up there. So, I guess it's all relative. It's always where you are, where you sit. I never met Neil when I was in Houston, and folks in the astronaut never talked about him much. I realize now that the astronaut office respected his desire for more private life, and he didn't thrive on the attention like some folks do. And believe me, in an office full of type A+++ personalities, there's a few that like to talk about themselves. One of the stories that I did hear about was when Neil Armstrong was flying a lunar landing training vehicle. Dr. Carpentier has a picture of it later. But this was essentially a small, ungainly craft with a single gimbaling jet engine, parked about 4 feet behind you where you're sitting, and it was used to simulate the lunar lander. And it had an ejection seat in it. To picture how dangerous this craft was, it might be helpful to know that almost all of the 5 craft of these training craft that were built were lost in crashes to test pilots. Not just people who said, hey, let me go try this. The craft went out of control and Neil ejected safely. This was about 1 year before his mission. An hour or two later, after he ejects out of this aircraft, Neil was seen back at work in his office. That alone told me what kind of person he was. No big deal, just doing my job. I've got more work to do, back to the office. Fast forward several years, I had left the Navy and the astronaut office and moved to Monterey, California, where I am today. A person who works at the Naval Postgraduate School had a friend of a friend who wondered if I wanted to attend a talk by Neil Armstrong at De Anza College in San Jose. So in March 2005, I heard Neil talk to a crowd of thousands talking about mining. Here's Neil talking about mining helium-3 in the moon's regolith, and some funny stories as well. And I thought, wow, not only is this guy humble, but smart and witty too. A sense of his humor and character was captured in his answers to a couple of questions that evening. He was asked a question about intelligent life on planets, and he responded, I'm still looking for intelligent life here on Earth. He was also asked about surviving so many close calls, and you already heard about some of those close calls here today. He was asked, does anything ever rattle you? Does anything ever rattle you? And he said, not only do I get rattled, but I make mistakes just like everyone else. Again, with humility. Later that evening, I attended a reception in his honor. I could see Neil from afar. I felt like I was at this rock concert with everyone clamoring to meet the first man on the moon. And by the way, I think he would be the first one to argue that it wasn't the case. It was his crew, including Buzz and Mike. Even though Mike never stepped on the surface, I know that he was there in spirit. I gradually made it up to Neil. He saw my astronaut pin here, and he gave me a huge smile and shook my hand and started asking questions about me. And I'm like, wait, you're Neil Armstrong. I want to ask you questions. I was so nervous meeting this great person, and he immediately treated me like a friend. And quite honestly, I don't think it mattered whether I was an astronaut or not. I think he treated everybody that he met with that type of respect and interest. I learned most of what I know about Neil Armstrong from the authorized biography written by James Hansen in 2005. Not only was he a cool, calm, and collected test pilot, he had a deep philosophical side. When asked about humans living on the moon, he said, "We will see a manned scientific station manned by an international crew very much like the Antarctic station. But there's a much more important question than whether man will be able to live on the moon. We have to ask ourselves whether man will be able to live together down here on Earth." Before applying to the astronaut program, many of you know that Neil was an accomplished test pilot flying the X-15, but perhaps not many realize that about the same time, in 1961, he suffered a great tragedy, one that is a nightmare for every parent. He lost his 2-year-old daughter, Karen, to cancer. Some think that this loss may have influenced him to refocus his energies toward the space program. Neil Armstrong was always a strong supporter of education, especially engineering. I can only imagine the thousands of young people he inspired to pursue degrees in engineering. He was always one to focus on the achievements of our space program and not his own celebrity. One of the other quotes from the book is as follows: "I think people should be recognized for their achievements and the value that adds to the value that it adds to society's progress, but it can be overdone. I think highly of many people and their accomplishments, but I don't believe that should be paramount over the actual achievements themselves. Celebrity shouldn't supersede the things that they've accomplished." That's Neil Armstrong. I also believe that Neil Armstrong firmly believed in something that I heard fellow astronaut John Young say once before. It isn't so much what we've done, but what we gotta do. I feel that Neil Armstrong firmly believed in our country continuing to move forward in our space program. I'm looking forward to hearing Dr. Carpentier share some stories about Neil. Thank you again for including me in this tribute to American hero, Neil Armstrong. Thank you.